The social worker's scissors gleamed under the fluorescent lights as 15-year-old Maya Blackhorse backed against the wall, her hands desperately protecting the eagle feathers woven into her long black hair. "These are sacred," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My grandmother blessed them before she died." But Miss Henderson wasn't listening. She'd already decided that Maya's traditional Navajo hair ornaments violated the group home's hygiene policy. What happened next would change both their lives forever and reveal a truth about Maya's past that no one saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Denver Department of Social Services building looked exactly like Maya Blackhorse had imagined hell would look. Gray concrete walls, buzzing fluorescent lights that made everyone's skin appear sickly, and the overwhelming smell of industrial disinfectant that couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of desperation and broken dreams. She sat in the hard plastic chair outside Miss Patricia Henderson's office, her fingers unconsciously stroking the 3 eagle feathers that hung from a small section of her braided hair, each one representing a prayer her late grandmother had whispered over her before the cancer took her voice away. Maya had been in the system for 8 months now, bouncing between temporary placements ever since the accident that killed her parents on Highway 160, just outside Cortez. 8 months of caseworkers who mispronounced her name, foster families who looked at her like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood, and group homes where she was just another file number waiting for her 18th birthday to age out of care. The door opened with a sharp click, and Miss Henderson appeared, a thin woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the wrinkles from her forehead. She wore a beige pantsuit that matched her personality, and carried herself with the rigid efficiency of someone who'd spent 23 years processing human misery into manageable paperwork. "Maya Blackhorse," she said, checking her clipboard. "Come in." Maya followed her into the cramped office, past walls lined with filing cabinets and motivational posters that seemed to mock the reality of the situation. Ms. Henderson settled behind her desk, which was organized with the precision of a military operation, 3 neat stacks of files, a coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Caseworker," and a small plastic container filled with paperclips sorted by color. "I've been reviewing your file," Ms. Henderson began, not bothering to look up. "Multiple placement disruptions, issues with authority figures, and now this latest incident at the Riverside Group home." She finally raised her eyes to meet Maya's. "Fighting with other residents," they said. Maya's jaw tightened. "Tanya Rodriguez was making fun of my grandmother's necklace. Said it looked like something from a cheap tourist shop. That's not grounds for physical violence, Maya. We've talked about this before." Ms. Henderson opened the file and began reading from a report. Anger management issues, difficulty with peer relationships, resistance to integrating into group home culture. Maybe the culture needs to change, Maya muttered under her breath. Ms. Henderson's pen stopped moving. "Excuse me?" "Nothing." The caseworker leaned back in her chair, studying Maya with the detached interest of a scientist examining a particularly troublesome specimen. "Maya, I'm going to be direct with you. You're 15 years old, which means you have potentially 3 more years in the system. 3 more years of bouncing between placements if you don't start making an effort to fit in. Your behavior is making you essentially unadoptable." The word hit Maya like a physical blow. Unadoptable, as if she were a broken appliance that couldn't be fixed. She touched the eagle feathers again, drawing strength from the memory of her grandmother's weathered hands, weaving them into her hair on the morning of her 13th birthday. "Now," Ms. Henderson continued, pulling out a form, "we've found a new placement for you. The Evergreen Center is a residential facility specifically designed for difficult cases. They have structure, discipline, and most importantly, they have rules about personal appearance and hygiene that will help you learn to conform to societal expectations. Maya felt her stomach drop. She'd heard about places like Evergreen, institutional facilities that were one step away from juvenile detention, where kids went to be warehoused rather than helped. What kind of rules? Maya asked, though she already suspected she knew the answer. Ms. Henderson consulted another paper in the file. Standard grooming policies. Hair must be kept neat and clean, no longer than shoulder length for girls. No jewelry except small earrings. No cultural ornaments or decorative items that could be considered unsanitary or potentially dangerous. Maya's hand moved instinctively to her feathers. These aren't decorative items. They're sacred. My grandmother, Maya, Ms. Henderson interrupted, her voice taking on the patronizing tone that child welfare workers seem to learn in training. I understand that your cultural background is important to you, but you need to understand that these traditions can sometimes prevent you from moving forward in life. Sometimes we have to let go of the past to embrace the future. The silence in the room was deafening. Maya stared at the woman across from her, this stranger who thought she understood what was best for a Navajo girl she'd known for all of 20 minutes across 3 brief meetings. The fluorescent light above them buzzed and flickered, casting intermittent shadows that made Ms. Henderson's face appear almost skeletal. When do I have to go? Maya asked quietly. Transport will pick you up tomorrow morning at 9. You'll want to pack light. Evergreen provides most personal items, and their intake process includes, she consulted her notes again, grooming and hygiene orientation. Maya nodded slowly, her mind already racing. She knew what grooming orientation meant. She'd heard the stories from other native kids in the system. The forced haircuts, the confiscation of traditional items, the systematic stripping away of anything that connected them to their heritage. It was boarding school all over again, just with a different name and fancier justification. Is there anything else? Ms. Henderson asked, already reaching for the next file in her stack. Can I call my great-aunt in Shiprock? She's been trying to get approved for kinship placement. Maya, we've been over this. Mrs. Begay is 82 years old and lives in a 1-bedroom trailer without reliable electricity. The state of Colorado has standards for child placement that prioritize safety and stability over familial connections. Evergreen can provide you with the structure and support you need to become a productive member of society. Maya wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Her great-aunt Elizabeth had raised 6 children of her own, served as a traditional healer for their community for over 40 years, and possessed more wisdom in her weathered pinky finger than Ms. Henderson had in her entire body. But because she didn't have central air conditioning and high-speed internet, she was deemed unfit to care for her own great-niece. The transport will be here at 9 sharp. Ms. Henderson repeated, making a note in Maya's file. I suggest you spend tonight preparing yourself mentally for this new opportunity. Sometimes change is exactly what we need to grow. Maya stood up slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. As she reached for the door handle, she turned back one final time. Miss Henderson, can I ask you something? The caseworker looked up impatiently. What is it, Maya? Do you have children? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Yes, a daughter. She's in college now, studying pre-law. Did you ever cut her hair against her will? Ms. Henderson's expression hardened. That's completely different, Maya. My daughter wasn't in the system because of behavioral issues and cultural resistance. Maya nodded slowly. Right, because she was lucky enough to be born into the right culture. She left the office before Ms. Henderson could respond, walking through the maze of gray hallways toward the exit. Other kids and their caseworkers sat in similar plastic chairs, having similar conversations, their voices blending into a symphony of bureaucratic disappointment. Maya pushed through the glass doors and into the Denver afternoon, where the September air carried the first hint of approaching autumn. The group home was a 20-minute bus ride away, through neighborhoods that grew progressively more worn and forgotten with each stop. Maya stared out the window at the passing scenery, chain restaurants and strip malls giving way to older apartment buildings and houses with bars on their windows. She thought about her grandmother's stories of their ancestors, who had endured forced marches and government schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Here she was, more than a century later, facing the same systematic erasure, just packaged in the language of child welfare and social services. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Riverside Group home sat on a corner lot, a two-story brick building that had probably been someone's dream house in the 1960s before being converted into temporary housing for society's unwanted children. Maya climbed the front steps, past the small garden where Mrs. Chen, the house manager, grew vegetables that none of the kids were allowed to touch. The screen door creaked as she entered, and the familiar sounds of institutional life washed over her. Televisions blaring from different rooms, someone arguing about chores in the kitchen, a younger kid crying in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Her roommate, Jessica Walsh, was lying on her narrow bed, scrolling through her phone with the practiced indifference of a 17-year-old who'd given up on adults long ago. Jessica had been in care since she was 9, bouncing between relatives and foster homes until she'd finally been placed at Riverside 6 months earlier. She was aging out in February and had already started talking about getting her own apartment and maybe taking classes at the community college. "How'd it go with the Ice Queen?" Jessica asked without looking up from her screen. Maya sat heavily on her own bed, the springs creaking under her weight. "I'm being transferred tomorrow. A place called Evergreen." Jessica's head snapped up. "Shit, Maya, that's not a group home. That's basically juvie for kids who haven't been charged with anything yet," I figured. "What did you do?" "I mean, besides the thing with Tanya, which honestly she had coming." Maya touched her feathers again, feeling their softness between her fingers. "I guess I exist wrong." Jessica set down her phone and sat up, giving Maya her full attention for the first time in weeks. "They want you to cut your hair, don't they?" Maya nodded, unable to trust her voice. "That's fucked up," Jessica said quietly. "I'm sorry, Maya. I know those feathers mean everything to you." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of tomorrow's separation settling between them like a physical presence. Jessica was one of the few kids in the system who'd never made fun of Maya's traditions or asked stupid questions about being native. She understood what it meant to have the system strip away pieces of yourself until you weren't sure who you were anymore. "What if you just took them out tonight?" Jessica suggested carefully. "Hide them somewhere. Maybe I could keep them for you and mail them when you get settled." Maya considered this, but shook her head. "They're not just decoration, Jess. They're part of a ceremony. Taking them out, it would break something that can't be fixed. So what are you going to do?" Maya lay back on her pillow, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a thunderbird if you squinted just right. "I don't know. But I'm not letting them cut my hair. These feathers stay where my grandmother put them." That evening, Maya barely touched her dinner, institutional meatloaf that tasted like cardboard and mashed potatoes that came from a box. She helped with kitchen cleanup duty, said goodnight to the younger kids who looked up to her, and packed her few belongings into the same duffel bag she'd carried from placement to placement. Everything she owned fit into one worn canvas bag, 3 changes of clothes, a photo of her parents taken at a powwow 2 years ago, her grandmother's turquoise necklace, a few books, and a small leather pouch containing sage and sweetgrass that she kept hidden from the staff. As she folded her clothes, Maya made a decision. Tomorrow, when the transport came, she wouldn't go quietly. She wouldn't let them turn her into another casualty of a system designed to erase everything that made her who she was. She'd fight, even if fighting meant consequences she couldn't imagine. Some things were worth the risk. She touched the eagle feathers one final time before turning off the light. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. But tonight she was still Maya Blackhorse, granddaughter of Sarah Blackhorse, keeper of sacred traditions, and no government form or institutional policy could change that. The last thing she heard before falling asleep was Jessica's whispered voice from across the room. "I've got your back tomorrow." Maya, whatever happens, Maya smiled in the darkness, knowing that even in the system's attempt to isolate and break them, the bonds between forgotten children could still provide moments of hope. Tomorrow would test everything she believed about herself and her culture. But tonight she wasn't alone. The transport van arrived at 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes early, driven by a man named Carl, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. He had the weathered face of someone who'd spent too many years ferrying troubled kids between facilities, his eyes holding that particular brand of exhaustion that comes from witnessing too much human wreckage without being able to fix any of it. Maya stood at the window of the group home, watching him check his clipboard and glance at his watch. Mrs. Chen bustled around behind her, making sure Maya had eaten breakfast and collected all her belongings, her maternal instincts kicking in despite the institutional boundaries that kept her from getting too attached to any of the kids who passed through her doors. "You sure you don't want me to call Miss Henderson?" Mrs. Chen asked for the third time. "Maybe explain about the feathers? Sometimes when people understand the cultural significance—" "No," Maya said firmly. "She won't understand. People like her never do." Jessica appeared beside them, still in her pajamas, despite the early hour. She pressed a small piece of paper into Maya's palm. "My email address, and my aunt's phone number in case something happens to me before you get out. Promise me you'll write." Maya nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In 8 months of system placement, Jessica was the closest thing to a real friend she'd found. They'd bonded over late-night conversations about dreams they were afraid to voice and futures that felt impossibly distant. Carl knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the wood with bureaucratic impatience. Mrs. Chen answered, and Maya heard their muffled conversation. Transport authorization, destination confirmation, estimated arrival time. The language of human cargo shipment disguised as child welfare. Maya Blackhorse. Carl called from the doorway. "Ready to roll?" Maya slung her duffel bag over her shoulder and walked toward the door, her hand instinctively moving to touch the eagle feathers one final time. They felt warm against her fingers, as if her grandmother's spirit was somehow present in their delicate barbs and hollow shafts. The van smelled like industrial air freshener and old coffee. Maya climbed into the back seat, noting the reinforced windows and door handles that could only be opened from the outside. Carl adjusted his rearview mirror to keep an eye on her as they pulled away from the curb, and Maya watched the group home grow smaller until it disappeared behind a row of cottonwood trees that were just beginning to turn yellow with approaching autumn. "First time at Evergreen?" Carl asked, making conversation the way adults did when they were uncomfortable with silence. "Yeah, it's not so bad. Structured, but not bad. Some kids actually do better with more rules, you know? Helps them understand boundaries." Maya stared out the window at the passing suburbs, where normal families were starting their normal days in houses with yards and mailboxes that had their actual names painted on them. She wondered what it would be like to wake up in the same bedroom every morning, to have a mother who packed your lunch and asked about homework, to belong somewhere without having to prove you deserved it. "What's your story?" Carl continued, "If you don't mind me asking. Been doing this job for 12 years, and I've learned most kids end up in the system for reasons that ain't their fault." Maya considered ignoring him, but something in his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than professional obligation. "Car accident. My parents died, and my great-aunt couldn't get approved for placement because she doesn't have running water in her kitchen." Carl whistled low. "That's rough, kid. I'm sorry. The state says she can't provide adequate care, but she raised 6 kids, and half the reservation calls her grandmother." "Go figure. Systems have their problems," Carl admitted. "Sometimes it feels like we're more interested in checking boxes than actually helping people." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the urban landscape gradually giving way to industrial areas, and then to the kind of commercial districts that existed solely to serve government institutions. Uniform buildings surrounded by chain-link fences, Parking lots full of state vehicles, and signs that bore official seals and mission statements nobody really believed in. Evergreen Center appeared around a bend in the road, like something out of a dystopian novel. It was a sprawling concrete complex, surrounded by 12-foot fencing, topped with razor wire, though Maya noted that the wire was designed to keep people in rather than out. The main building was 3 stories tall, with narrow windows that reminded her uncomfortably of the old boarding school photographs she'd seen in her high school history textbook. Carl pulled up to the security gate, where a guard in a blue uniform checked his paperwork with the thoroughness of someone processing maximum security inmates. The guard peered into the van, made eye contact with Maya, and checked something off on his clipboard before waving them through. The intake building was separate from the main facility, connected by a covered walkway that eliminated any chance of escape during the transfer process. Carl parked in a designated spot and came around to open Maya's door, his expression sympathetic but resigned. "Good luck in there, kid," he said as Maya climbed out. "Remember what I said about boundaries. Sometimes they help more than you think." The intake coordinator was a woman named Mrs. Franklin, who looked like she'd stepped out of a 1950s educational film about proper deportment. Her grey hair was styled in perfect waves. Her navy blue dress was pressed to military specifications, and her smile had the artificial warmth of someone who'd practiced it in a mirror until it looked almost genuine. "Maya Blackhorse," she said, consulting her tablet. "Welcome to Evergreen Center. I'm sure this transition feels overwhelming, but I want you to know that everything we do here is designed to help you become the best version of yourself." Maya followed her through a series of corridors lined with motivational posters and artificial plants, past offices with names like Behavioral Modification Specialist and Cultural Integration Counselor. The smell of disinfectant was even stronger here than at the social services building, as if they were trying to sterilize not just surfaces, but the very air itself. "Your room assignment is in Building C. Level 2, Mrs. Franklin continued, her heels clicking against the polished linoleum. "You'll be sharing with another girl your age, Emma Stevens. She's been with us for 6 months and has made remarkable progress in adapting to our community standards." They entered a small office that looked like a medical examination room crossed with a police booking facility, a metal desk, 2 chairs, a scale, and a cabinet filled with forms and supplies that Maya couldn't identify but didn't like the look of. "Now, let's get you processed," Mrs. Franklin said, settling behind the desk. "First, we'll need to inventory your personal belongings and determine which items meet our facility guidelines." Maya set her duffel bag on the desk and watched as Mrs. Franklin began removing items one by one, examining each piece with the scrutiny of a customs agent. The photograph of her parents was approved and set aside. Her clothes were inspected for gang colors, inappropriate logos, or anything that might be considered contraband. Her books were flipped through page by page to check for hidden items or offensive content. When Mrs. Franklin reached the leather pouch containing sage and sweetgrass, she paused. "What's this?" "Traditional medicine," Maya said carefully. "Sacred herbs used for prayer." Mrs. Franklin opened the pouch and sniffed its contents, her nose wrinkling slightly. "I'm afraid this violates our substance policy. All medications and herbal preparations must be administered through our medical staff. They're not medicine like that. They're for a ceremony, for spiritual practice. Maya, I understand that your cultural background includes certain practices that may seem important to you, but part of your growth process here involves learning to separate helpful traditions from those that might prevent you from fully integrating into mainstream society." She sealed the pouch in a clear plastic bag and labeled it with Maya's name and the date. "These will be stored in our property room. You can discuss their return with your counselor once you've demonstrated readiness to handle such responsibility." Maya felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. They were taking away her prayers, literally confiscating her connection to her ancestors and her culture. She watched Mrs. Franklin continue through her belongings with mechanical efficiency, separating Maya's life into categories of approved, conditional, and contraband. Finally, Mrs. Franklin reached her grandmother's turquoise necklace. She held it up to the fluorescent light, examining the silver work and the deep blue stones that seemed to hold pieces of sky captured in mineral form. "This is quite beautiful," she said. "Turquoise is considered a semi-precious stone, which puts it in violation of our jewelry policy. Residents are allowed one pair of small earrings and a watch, nothing more." "Please," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother made that. It's all I have left of her." Mrs. Franklin's expression softened slightly, but her hands remained firm as she placed the necklace in another evidence bag. "Maya, I know this is difficult, but these attachments to material objects are often what prevent young people from moving forward. Sometimes we have to let go of the past to embrace the future." The words were almost identical to what Miss Henderson had said, as if they'd all attended the same training seminar on how to systematically destroy a child's cultural identity while making it sound like therapy. "Now," Mrs. Franklin continued, "let's discuss your personal grooming. I see from your file that there have been some concerns about your adherence to standard hygiene policies." Maya's hand moved instinctively to her feathers, which had somehow survived the inventory process so far, probably because they looked like simple hair accessories to someone who didn't understand their significance. "Your hair is quite long," Mrs. Franklin observed, "and I notice you have some decorative elements woven into it. Our grooming policy requires hair to be kept at shoulder length or shorter, and we don't allow any accessories that could pose a safety risk or distraction to other residents." "The feathers aren't decorative," Maya said, her voice stronger now. "They're sacred. My grandmother blessed them in a ceremony before she died. Removing them would be like cutting away part of my soul." Mrs. Franklin nodded with the patient understanding of someone who'd heard similar objections countless times before. "Maya, I appreciate that these items hold sentimental value for you, but part of maturing involves learning when to hold on to traditions and when to release them for our own good and the good of our community. The feathers will be removed as part of your intake grooming, and your hair will be trimmed to regulation length. This will help you focus on your behavioral goals without the distraction of managing excessive hair length." Maya felt the room tilt slightly, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. They were going to cut her hair. They were going to remove her grandmother's feathers, the last physical connection she had to her family's prayers and her own identity as a Navajo woman. And they were going to do it while telling her it was for her own good. "What if I refuse?" Maya asked. Mrs. Franklin consulted her tablet. "Refusal to comply with facility grooming policies results in loss of privileges and placement in our intensive behavioral modification program. Continued refusal can result in physical restraint and involuntary grooming for health and safety reasons." The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in bureaucratic language. Maya understood now why Jessica had looked so stricken when she'd heard about the transfer. This wasn't a group home or even a treatment facility. This was a place designed to break kids down and rebuild them into whatever shape the state deemed acceptable. "I need to call my caseworker," Maya said. "You'll have access to supervised phone calls once you've completed the intake process and demonstrated compliance with facility policies," Mrs. Franklin replied. "Right now, let's focus on getting you settled in. The sooner you complete orientation, the sooner you can begin working toward your goals." A knock on the door interrupted them. Mrs. Franklin called, "Come in," and Maya turned to see a large man in a security uniform enter the room. He had the build of someone who'd spent serious time in a gym and the demeanor of someone who enjoyed using his physical advantages to intimidate teenagers. "This is Officer Martinez," Mrs. Franklin explained. He'll escort you to the grooming station and then to your room assignment. Maya looked from Mrs. Franklin to Officer Martinez, understanding that the illusion of choice had just evaporated. She could comply voluntarily or be forced to comply, but either way, she was going to lose her feathers and her hair and another piece of who she'd been before the system got its hands on her. "Maya," Mrs. Franklin said gently, "I know this feels overwhelming, but thousands of young people have come through our program and gone on to lead successful, productive lives. Trust the process. Sometimes the most difficult changes are the ones that help us grow the most." Maya stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Officer Martinez stepped aside to let her pass, his hand resting casually on his radio, as if she might suddenly transform into some kind of dangerous fugitive. As they walked down another sterile corridor toward whatever fresh hell awaited her, Maya made herself a promise. They could cut her hair. They could take away her grandmother's feathers, and her sacred herbs, and her turquoise necklace. They could try to erase every visible sign of who she was and where she came from. But they couldn't touch the prayers her grandmother had spoken over her, the stories that lived in her memory, or the strength she'd inherited from generations of women who'd survived worse than this. She was Maya Blackhorse, and no institution could change that, no matter how hard they tried. The grooming station occupied a corner of the intake building that had clearly been designed with efficiency rather than comfort in mind. 3 barber chairs sat in a row, facing a wall of mirrors, their chrome surfaces reflecting the harsh, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were suffering from some kind of wasting disease. The floor was covered in industrial linoleum that had been scrubbed so many times the pattern had worn away in places, leaving ghostly outlines where countless other kids had sat and watched pieces of themselves fall away. Officer Martinez positioned himself by the door, while Mrs. Franklin consulted her tablet, scrolling through what Maya assumed were grooming protocols and behavioral modification procedures. The woman operating the grooming station introduced herself as Ms. Garcia, a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes who looked genuinely uncomfortable with her assignment. "Honey, I need you to sit in the middle chair," Ms. Garcia said softly, her accent carrying traces of New Mexico that reminded Maya painfully of home. "I'm going to try to make this as easy as possible for you, okay?" Maya remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest, in a gesture that felt more defensive than defiant. "What if I said no?" Ms. Garcia glanced nervously at Officer Martinez, whose hand had moved closer to his radio. "Sweetie, we both know that's not really an option. But I promise you I'll be gentle. I've got granddaughters about your age, and I know how important hair can be to a young woman." "It's not about vanity," Maya said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "These feathers were blessed by my grandmother. They're part of a sacred ceremony. Cutting them out would be like desecrating a church." Mrs. Franklin looked up from her tablet with the patient expression of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly slow student. "Maya, while I respect your cultural attachments, you need to understand that symbolic gestures often hold us back from practical growth. Your grandmother would want you to succeed in life, wouldn't she? Sometimes that means adapting to new environments and expectations." The casual dismissal of her grandmother's spiritual authority hit Maya like a physical blow. She thought about Sarah Blackhorse, who had served as a medicine woman for their community for over 60 years, who had guided young people through naming ceremonies and healing rituals, who had carried the prayers of 4 generations in her weathered hands. The idea that this bureaucrat in her polyester dress suit knew better than her grandmother about Maya's spiritual needs was so absurd, it was almost funny. "You didn't know my grandmother," Maya said quietly. "She survived boarding school, where they cut off her braids and beat her for speaking Navajo. She told me stories about kids who tried to run home and were brought back in chains. She said the most important thing was to never let them make you forget who you are." Ms. Garcia had stopped pretending to organize her tools and was listening intently. her brown eyes reflecting an understanding that the other adults in the room seemed incapable of accessing. Maya wondered if she too had family stories about cultural erasure disguised as education, about traditions that had to be practiced in secret to survive. "Maya," Mrs. Franklin said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "I understand you've experienced loss, and it's natural to cling to objects that remind you of departed loved ones. But this behavior is exactly why you're here. You're resisting authority, refusing to integrate with community standards, and prioritizing symbolic attachments over practical necessities. These are the patterns we need to break if you're going to have any chance of aging out successfully." Officer Martinez stepped forward slightly, not quite a threat but definitely a reminder of his presence. Maya gauged the distance to the door, calculating her chances of making it past him and somehow navigating the maze of corridors back to the main entrance. Even if she managed to escape the building, she was in the middle of nowhere with no money, no phone, and nowhere to go except back into the system that had brought her here. What happens to kids who don't comply? Maya asked. Mrs. Franklin consulted her tablet again. Depending on the severity of the resistance, consequences can include loss of privileges, placement in behavioral modification isolation, physical restraint for safety purposes, or transfer to a more secure facility. We prefer positive reinforcement, but we have protocols for managing non-compliant residents. Maya sat down in the barber chair, not because she was surrendering, but because she needed time to think. The leather seat was cracked and patched with duct tape, and she could see the accumulated hair of previous victims scattered around the base, despite Ms. Garcia's obvious efforts to keep the area clean. She wondered how many other kids had sat in this same chair, watching their identities disappear one snip at a time. Ms. Garcia approached her with obvious reluctance, holding a comb and scissors that looked like they'd seen heavy use. "Mija, I'm going to start by sectioning your hair, okay? We'll take it slow." Maya caught her reflection in the mirror and was startled by how young she looked. At 15, she was still caught between childhood and adulthood, her face retaining enough softness to remind observers that she was barely past middle school age. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no child should have. But her overall appearance was that of someone who should be worrying about algebra homework and whether her crush liked her back, not fighting institutional policies designed to strip away her cultural identity. "Tell me about the feathers," Ms. Garcia said quietly, her hands hovering near Maya's hair without making contact. "What ceremony were they from?" Maya glanced at Mrs. Franklin, who was typing notes into her tablet with mechanical efficiency, apparently confident that the actual grooming process was merely a formality. Officer Martinez had relaxed slightly, though he remained positioned between Maya and the exit. "When I turned 13, my grandmother performed a Quina Alda ceremony," Maya explained, speaking directly to Ms. Garcia's reflection in the mirror. "It's a coming-of-age ritual for Navajo girls. She wove these 3 feathers into my hair while she prayed for my strength, my wisdom, and my connection to our ancestors. Each feather carries specific blessings that are supposed to guide me through life." Ms. Garcia nodded slowly, her own reflection showing a woman caught between institutional obligations and personal conscience. "And if they're removed incorrectly?" "The prayers are broken," Maya said simply. "The connection is severed. It's not just about losing the feathers, it's about losing the spiritual protection and guidance they represent." Mrs. Franklin looked up from her tablet with obvious impatience. "Ms. Garcia, we have a schedule to maintain. Please proceed with the standard grooming protocol." Ms. Garcia hesitated, her scissors still unopened in her hand. "Mrs. Franklin, maybe we could make an exception this time. The feathers are small, and they're not really causing any safety issues." "Ms. Garcia, we've discussed this type of situation in training. Making exceptions based on claimed cultural or religious significance opens the door to manipulation and favoritism. Every resident receives identical treatment according to facility policies, regardless of background." "Please proceed." Maya watched the internal struggle play out across Ms. Garcia's face, the conflict between human decency and bureaucratic compliance that defined so much of institutional life. She could see that the woman wanted to help, but she also understood the reality of job security and the price of defying authority in a system designed to crush individual initiative. "I'm sorry." "Mija," Ms. Garcia whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have to follow the rules." Maya closed her eyes as she felt the comb moving through her hair, sectioning it into manageable portions for cutting. The familiar weight of her long black hair would soon be gone, along with the physical manifestations of her grandmother's prayers. She tried to focus on the stories she'd been told about Navajo women who had endured far worse: the long walk, the boarding schools, the forced sterilizations, the systematic attempts to eliminate their people entirely. The sound of scissors cutting through hair was surprisingly loud in the quiet room, each snip echoing off the concrete walls like a small gunshot. Maya felt the first section of hair fall away, landing on her shoulder, before sliding down to join the growing pile on the floor. Ms. Garcia worked with practiced efficiency, her movements gentle despite the institutional context. "Maya, I want you to think about this as a new beginning," Mrs. Franklin said without looking up from her documentation. "Sometimes we have to shed old patterns and attachments to make room for growth and positive change." Maya opened her eyes and watched in the mirror as more of her hair fell away. The girl looking back at her was becoming a stranger, still recognizably Maya, but somehow diminished, as if essential parts of her were being removed along with the hair. She thought about her mother, who had worn her own hair long until the day she died, and her grandmother, whose steel-grey braids had reached nearly to her waist, even in her 80s. As Ms. Garcia worked her way around Maya's head, systematically reducing the length to regulation shoulder length, Maya focused on memorizing the weight and texture of her grandmother's feathers. She could feel them still woven into the section that Ms. Garcia hadn't reached yet, their presence like a small flame of resistance in an ocean of compliance. "Almost finished with the length adjustment," Ms. Garcia announced, her voice professionally neutral, but her eyes apologetic in the mirror. "Now I need to address the decorative elements." This was the moment Maya had been dreading. She felt Ms. Garcia's fingers locate the first feather, gently working to separate it from the braided section where her grandmother had woven it more than 2 years ago. The feather had become part of her hair's structure, integrated so carefully that removing it would require cutting away the surrounding strands. "Please," Maya said one final time, her voice cracking despite her efforts to remain strong. "They're all I have left of her, all I have left of who I'm supposed to be." Ms. Garcia's hands stilled, the first feather held delicately between her fingers. Maya could see tears forming in the woman's eyes, and she realized that this was probably as difficult for Ms. Garcia as it was for her. How many cultural violations had she been forced to commit in the name of institutional policy? How many pieces of other kids' identities had fallen to the floor of this sterile room? "Mrs. Franklin," Ms. Garcia said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "I need to speak with you privately before we continue." Mrs. Franklin looked up with obvious irritation. "Ms. Garcia, we've already discussed this. The grooming protocol is non-negotiable." "Just 5 minutes," Ms. Garcia insisted. "Please," Mrs. Franklin sighed and set down her tablet. "Officer Martinez, please maintain supervision of the resident while Ms. Garcia and I step outside." Maya watched them leave through the reflection in the mirror, Mrs. Franklin's posture radiating bureaucratic frustration, while Ms. Garcia walked with the determined stride of someone who had finally found the courage to stand up for what was right. Through the partially open door, Maya could hear the beginning of their conversation, Ms. Garcia's rapid, passionate Spanish mixing with Mrs. Franklin's clipped, professional English in a linguistic battle that seemed to mirror the larger cultural conflicts playing out throughout the facility. Officer Martinez remained by the door, his expression unreadable behind his professional mask. Maya wondered what he thought about his job, whether he'd joined facility security to help troubled kids, or simply because it offered steady employment with decent benefits. Did he ever go home at night and think about the children he'd helped restrain and process through institutional machinery designed to reshape them into acceptable citizens? The conversation outside grew more heated, though Maya couldn't make out specific words. She found herself hoping that Ms. Garcia was winning, that somewhere in this sterile bureaucratic maze was a person with enough authority and compassion to recognize that some things were too sacred to sacrifice on the altar of institutional convenience. When the door opened again, both women returned with expressions that revealed nothing about the outcome of their private discussion. Mrs. Franklin reclaimed her position with her tablet while Ms. Garcia approached. The barber chair with careful, measured steps. "Maya," Ms. Garcia said quietly, "I want you to know that I spoke with Mrs. Franklin about the cultural significance of your feathers." Maya held her breath, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself from believing that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally listened. Ms. Garcia picked up her scissors again. But instead of moving toward Maya's remaining hair, she set them down on the counter with a decisive click that seemed to echo through the small room like a gavel striking wood. "Mrs. Franklin, I can't do this," she said, her voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had finally found her line in the sand. "I've been working here for 8 years, and I've followed every policy, cut every head of hair that came through that door. But this is different. This girl isn't asking to keep long hair for fashion or rebellion. She's asking to keep her prayers." Mrs. Franklin's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching alarm. "Ms. Garcia, we've discussed this. Personal feelings cannot override institutional policies. If you're unable to perform your assigned duties, then fire me," Ms. Garcia interrupted, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. "I'd rather lose this job than cut away another child's connection to their ancestors. I've seen what happens to kids when you strip away everything that tells them who they are. They don't get better, they get lost." Maya felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room, as if the careful balance of power that kept institutional machinery running smoothly had suddenly been disrupted by an act of individual conscience. She watched Mrs. Franklin's face cycle through a series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, as she tried to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond the neat parameters of policy and procedure. "Ms. Garcia, step away from the resident immediately," Mrs. Franklin said, her voice taking on the cold authority of someone accustomed to absolute compliance. "Officer Martinez, please escort Ms. Garcia to my office. I'll handle the grooming myself." Officer Martinez moved forward reluctantly, his usual confidence replaced by obvious discomfort with the turn the situation had taken. Maya realized that even he understood the moral weight of what was happening. The difference between enforcing reasonable rules and participating in cultural violence disguised as institutional policy. "Wait," Maya said, standing up from the barber chair so quickly that everyone in the room froze. "Ms. Garcia, what's your grandmother's name?" The question seemed to come out of nowhere, but Ms. Garcia answered instinctively, "Isabella Garcia. She passed away 5 years ago. Why? What would she think of what you just did?" Ms. Garcia's eyes filled with tears. "She would be proud. She used to tell me stories about when she was a little girl, and the nuns at her school tried to make her forget Spanish. She said the worst thing you can do to a person is make them ashamed of who they are." Maya nodded, feeling a connection span across cultures and generations. The shared experience of indigenous women facing institutional erasure, the common thread of grandmothers who had survived systematic attempts to destroy their identities and pass down the strength to resist. "Mrs. Franklin," Maya said, turning to face the intake coordinator directly, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Maya, you are not in a position to make demands. Just one question," Maya pressed on. "Do you really believe that cutting these feathers out of my hair is going to make me a better person? Do you honestly think my grandmother's prayers are what's keeping me from succeeding in life?" The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the institution beyond the grooming station. Mrs. Franklin stared at Maya for a long moment, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal something more human underneath. Doubt, perhaps, or the accumulated weight of years spent implementing policies she'd never really examined. Maya, "It's not about the specific items," Mrs. Franklin said finally, her voice softer than it had been all morning. "It's about learning to adapt, to function in environments that may not accommodate every personal preference or cultural practice. The world isn't always going to honor your traditions, and we're trying to prepare you for that reality." "By destroying my traditions first?" Maya asked. "By making sure I have nothing left to honor?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya could see that it had hit its mark. Mrs. Franklin's certainty was cracking, revealing the uncomfortable truth that institutional policies often created the very problems they claimed to solve. The door to the grooming station opened, and a new voice entered the conversation, deep, authoritative, but carrying an undertone of warmth that was completely absent from the institutional voices Maya had grown accustomed to. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to see a tall man in his 60s standing in the doorway, his silver hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and his weathered hands bearing the calluses of someone who worked with them for a living. He wore jeans, boots, and a denim shirt that looked like they'd seen honest work, and his presence seemed to fill the sterile room with something that had been missing: authentic human authority based on respect rather than fear. "Mr. Coleman," Mrs. Franklin said, her voice taking on a defensive tone, "we're in the middle of resident intake processing. I wasn't aware you were scheduled to visit today. Got a call from someone concerned about a young Navajo girl who might need some help," the man said, his gray eyes settling on Maya with gentle interest. "Figured I'd drive over and see what was what." Maya stared at him, trying to place his face or understand how he could possibly know about her situation. He didn't look like a social worker or a lawyer or any other kind of official she'd encountered in the system. If anything, he looked like the ranchers and farmers she remembered from her childhood in New Mexico, people who measured their words carefully and backed them up with action when necessary. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Officer Martinez said, his hand moving to his radio. "This is a secure facility, and you don't have clearance to be in the intake area." Mr. Coleman reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which he handed to Mrs. Franklin with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what it contained. As she read it, her expression shifted from defensive irritation to something approaching panic. "This is a court order," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emergency injunction filed about an hour ago," Mr. Coleman confirmed. Judge Patricia Morrison signed it after reviewing evidence that this facility has been systematically violating the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Specifically, the part about protecting indigenous religious practices in state-supervised facilities. Maya felt her knees go weak. Someone, somehow, had gone to court on her behalf. Someone had cared enough about her situation to challenge the institutional machinery that had been grinding away at her identity since the moment she'd entered the system. "Who are you?" Maya asked. Mr. Coleman smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something approaching grandfatherly. "Name's Robert Coleman. I run a ranch about 40 miles from here, and I've got what you might call a special interest in kids who've been failed by the system. Especially kids whose cultural heritage is being treated like a problem to be solved instead of a gift to be honored." "How did you know about Maya?" Ms. Garcia asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Got a call this morning from a social worker named Jennifer Chen, who works at a group home in Denver. She said there was a Navajo girl being transferred to Evergreen who was about to lose something sacred, and she wondered if there was anything that could be done about it. Maya's heart leaped. Mrs. Chen had kept her promise to try to help, had somehow tracked down this stranger, who apparently had the power to challenge institutional policies with court orders and legal injunctions. "The injunction is very specific," Mr. Coleman continued, addressing Mrs. Franklin directly. "No cultural or religious items are to be removed from Maya Blackhorse without a hearing before a federal judge. No haircuts or grooming procedures that violate indigenous religious practices, and no retaliation against facility staff who refuse to participate in such violations." He glanced at Ms. Garcia with approval. "Sounds like you've got at least one employee who understands the difference between following orders and following conscience." Mrs. Franklin was reading through the court order again, her face pale as she absorbed the legal implications of what had just happened. Maya realized that this was probably the first time in the woman's career that her authority had been challenged by something more powerful than teenage defiance or parental complaints. "This is highly irregular," Mrs. Franklin said finally. "We'll need to contact our legal department and review our options for appeal." "You're certainly welcome to do that," Mr. Coleman said agreeably. "In the meantime, Maya's coming with me. I've got emergency foster placement authorization from the state, and Judge Morrison has approved temporary custody pending a full hearing on her case." Maya felt the room spin slightly around her. In the space of 15 minutes, her situation had gone from hopeless to something that looked almost like salvation. But years in the system had taught her to be wary of sudden reversals of fortune. They usually came with hidden costs or unexpected complications. "I don't understand," she said. "You don't even know me. Why would you fight a court battle for a stranger?" Mr. Coleman's expression grew serious. "Maya, I've spent the last 20 years providing emergency foster care for kids who've been chewed up by the system, particularly native kids who've been separated from their families and their cultures. I've seen what places like this do to young people in the name of helping them, and I've learned that sometimes the only way to stop institutional abuse is to drag it into federal court and make it too expensive for them to continue." He looked around the grooming station, taking in the barber chairs and the pile of Maya's cut hair on the floor. The mirrors that had reflected so much forced compliance over the years. Besides, my late wife Catherine would never forgive me if I let them cut away a young woman's prayers. She was Cherokee, and she taught me that some things are too sacred to compromise on. No matter what the bureaucrats say, Maya felt tears starting to form. But for the first time in months, they weren't tears of frustration or despair. Someone had listened. Someone had cared enough to take action. Someone understood that her grandmother's feathers weren't just decorative accessories but living connections to a spiritual tradition that stretched back through generations of strong women who had refused to let their identities be erased. "So what happens now?" Maya asked. "Now we get you out of here," Mr. Coleman said. "You'll stay at my ranch while the lawyers sort out the legal details and figure out a permanent placement solution. You'll have your own room, access to a phone so you can call your great-aunt, and nobody's going to touch those feathers. Unless you decide you want them touched." Maya looked at her. Reflection in the mirror one final time, hair shorter than it. Had been since childhood, but still, carrying her grandmother's sacred feathers, still visibly connected to the traditions that defined her identity. She had lost something today. But she had also gained something perhaps even more valuable, the knowledge that there were still people in the world who would fight for what was right, even for strangers, even against institutional power. "Can Ms. Garcia come visit me?" Maya asked. Mr. Coleman smiled. "Maya, anyone who stands up to bureaucratic bullying the way Ms. Garcia just did is welcome at my table any time. And I suspect she might be interested in hearing about some job opportunities that don't involve cutting away pieces of kids' souls." As they prepared to leave the grooming station, Maya caught Ms. Garcia's eye in the mirror one final time. The woman, who had found the courage to put conscience above compliance, gave her a small nod of encouragement. And Maya understood that sometimes the most important battles are won not by the people with the most power, but by the people with the most heart. The ride to Robert Coleman's ranch took them through Colorado countryside that Maya had never seen before. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, fence lines that stretched toward distant mountains, and small towns that looked like they'd been frozen in time somewhere around 1975. Maya sat in the passenger seat of Coleman's pickup truck, a dusty blue Ford that smelled like leather and hay and something indefinably clean that she eventually realized was the absence of institutional disinfectant. Coleman drove with the easy confidence of someone who'd traveled these roads thousands of times, one weathered hand on the steering wheel while the other rested on the window frame. He didn't try to fill the silence with awkward small talk or therapeutic questions about her feelings, which Maya appreciated more than he could possibly know. After months of caseworkers and counselors who seemed to think every moment of quiet needed to be analyzed and addressed, his comfortable silence felt like a gift. "You hungry?" he asked as they passed through a small town called Cedar Valley, population 847 according to the faded green sign. "There's a decent diner here if you want real food, instead of whatever they were planning to feed you at that place." Maya's stomach growled in response, reminding her that she'd barely touched breakfast that morning at the group home. The prospect of choosing her own meal, of sitting in a normal restaurant like a regular person instead of lining up in an institutional cafeteria, seemed almost impossibly luxurious. "Yes, please," she said. The Bluebird Diner occupied a corner lot on Main Street, its chrome exterior and neon sign marking it as a survivor from an earlier era of American roadside dining. Inside, red vinyl booths lined the windows, while a long counter separated customers from a kitchen where Maya could hear the comforting sounds of food being prepared by people who seemed to care about what they were making. Coleman chose a booth near the back, nodding to several other patrons who called out greetings as they passed. Maya realized that this was what it meant to belong somewhere, to be recognized not as a case number or a problem to be managed, but simply as Robert Coleman, who ran cattle and helped kids and apparently made decent enough pie to warrant friendly teasing from the locals. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with gray hair escaping from under a hairnet, approached their table with the easy familiarity of a long acquaintance. "Bob Coleman, what brings you to town on a Wednesday afternoon? Don't tell me you're finally ready to ask me to run away with you," Coleman laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "Sorry, Dolores. Marge would never forgive me if I stole her best customer away from the beauty shop. I'd like you to meet Maya. She's going to be staying at the ranch for a while." Dolores turned her attention to Maya with the kind of frank appraisal that small-town people seem to specialize in. Not unkind, but thorough enough to form accurate judgments quickly. Maya braced herself for the usual questions about where she was from and why she wasn't with her parents, but Dolores simply smiled and handed her a menu. "Welcome to Cedar Valley, honey. What sounds good to you?" Maya studied the menu, overwhelmed by the simple act of being allowed to choose from options that included things like chocolate chip pancakes and double cheeseburgers and pie that was made fresh that morning. After months of institutional food designed for nutritional adequacy rather than pleasure, the possibilities seemed endless. "Could I have a cheeseburger?" she asked tentatively. "And maybe some fries?" "Make that 2, Coleman added. "And Maya, if you want dessert, Dolores makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. Don't let her tell you otherwise." As Dolores headed back to place their order, Coleman leaned back in his booth and studied Maya with the same careful attention she'd noticed during their drive. She wondered what he was seeing: a damaged kid who needed fixing, a cultural artifact to be preserved, or simply a 15-year-old girl who'd had a really terrible day. "You want to call your great-aunt?" he asked. "Let her know where you are and that you're safe?" Maya nodded, realizing that she hadn't spoken to Aunt Elizabeth since her last placement meeting 3 weeks ago. The system discouraged too much contact with family members who couldn't provide approved placement options. as if maintaining emotional connections might somehow interfere with the process of institutional rehabilitation. Coleman handed her his phone, a simple flip model that looked like it had survived several cattle seasons. "Take your time. I'll be right here." Maya dialed the number she'd memorized, but rarely been allowed to use, listening to it ring across the miles to the little trailer, outside Shiprock, where her great-aunt lived without running water but with more wisdom and love than all. The social services departments in Colorado combined. "Hello." Elizabeth Begay's voice was exactly as Maya remembered, strong despite her 82 years, warm with the kind of unconditional acceptance that Maya had almost forgotten existed. "Aunt Elizabeth?" "It's Maya." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds, and Maya realized her great-aunt was crying. When Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion and relief. "Maya, child, where are you? I've been calling that caseworker every week, but she keeps telling me you're in a placement that's meeting your needs. I knew something was wrong when they wouldn't let me talk to you." Maya found herself crying too. Months of accumulated isolation and fear, finally finding release in the sound of a voice that knew her, not as a case file, but as Sarah Blackhorse's granddaughter, the little girl who used to help gather herbs and listen to stories about the holy people. "I'm okay now, Aunt Elizabeth. I'm with someone who understands about the feathers, someone who stopped them from cutting them out." She could hear her great-aunt's sharp intake of breath. "They tried to cut your grandmother's feathers." "Maya, tell me everything." Maya told her about Evergreen, about Mrs. Franklin and the grooming station, about Miss Garcia's brave stand and Robert Coleman's unexpected intervention. Elizabeth listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of distress or approval as the story unfolded. "This man Coleman," Elizabeth said finally, "is he native?" "No, but his wife was. She passed away, but he said she was Cherokee. He seems to understand about sacred things." "Good. The spirits sent him to you. Maya, your grandmother's prayers are still protecting you, even from the other side." Elizabeth paused, and Maya could picture her in the little kitchen of her trailer, probably sitting at the wooden table where she prepared traditional medicines and held prayer meetings when people from the community needed healing. "Aunt Elizabeth, I want to come home. I want to live with you." "I know, child. I want that too. But these government people, they have rules about electricity and plumbing and things that don't matter for raising children, but matter for their paperwork. I've been working with a lawyer from the DNA Legal Services, trying to get approved for kinship placement. But it takes time." Maya felt a familiar stab of frustration at the system's priorities, a bureaucracy that valued indoor plumbing over cultural continuity, that prioritized institutional amenities over familial love. But for the first time in months, she also felt hope. Her great-aunt was fighting for her, and now she had allies like Robert Coleman, who understood how to navigate legal systems and challenge institutional authority. "Maya," Elizabeth continued, "I want you to listen to me carefully. This Coleman man, if he's willing to help you keep your grandmother's feathers, then he's a good person sent by the spirits. You stay with him, you learn what he has to teach you, and you remember that you are still Maya Blackhorse, no matter where you sleep at night. The prayers in those feathers are stronger than any government policy." They talked for another 15 minutes. Elizabeth sharing news from the reservation, and Maya describing her journey through the foster care system with more honesty than she'd been able to manage in any of her official therapy sessions. When she finally hung up, Maya felt lighter somehow, as if talking to her great-aunt had restored some essential part of herself that the system had been trying to systematically erase. Coleman had been quietly eating his burger while she talked, giving her privacy while remaining close enough to provide support if she needed it. As she handed his phone back, he looked up from his plate with gentle curiosity. "How's she doing?" "She's been fighting to get me placed with her. The state won't approve her because she doesn't have running water in her kitchen." Coleman shook his head with disgust. 20 years I've been doing this work, and I still can't get used to bureaucrats who think a child is better off in an institution than with loving family members. Your great-aunt sounds like a remarkable woman. She is. She's a traditional healer, and she knows more about taking care of people than all the social workers I've met combined. I'd like to meet her someday, Coleman said. Maybe we can figure out a way to make this kinship placement work. Sometimes these approval processes just need the right kind of pressure, applied in the right places. Maya looked at him with growing admiration and gratitude. Here was a man who barely knew her, who had already spent what was probably considerable money on legal fees and court filings, and he was now talking about helping her reunite with her family. She wondered what motivated people like him. What drove them to care about strangers' children when so many others seemed content to let the system grind away at vulnerable lives? Mr. Coleman, can I ask you something? Call me Bob and ask away. Why do you do this? Help kids like me, I mean. It must cost a lot of money, and it's not like we can pay you back. Bob finished chewing a bite of burger and considered her question seriously. You know what Catherine used to say? She said that sometimes the spirits put people in your path, not because you asked for them, but because they need what you have to give. She believed that helping was its own reward, that every time you stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, you make the whole world a little bit stronger. He paused, looking out the diner window at the main street, where pickup trucks and sedans moved at small-town speeds past businesses that had served the same families for generations. But if I'm being completely honest, Maya, I do it because 23 years ago, my nephew Danny aged out of the system and died of an overdose 6 months later. He was Lakota, my sister's boy, and the state took him when she died. Placed him in homes that didn't understand his culture, schools that made him ashamed of who he was. By the time he turned 18, he didn't know where he belonged or who he was supposed to be. Maya felt a chill of recognition. She'd met kids like Danny in every placement she'd been in, older teenagers who were counting down the days until they aged out, who talked about freedom, but whose eyes held the hollow look of people who'd been systematically disconnected from everything that might have anchored them to life. Catherine and we decided after Danny died that we wouldn't let the system destroy another Native kid if we could help it. Started taking emergency placements, kids who needed somewhere safe, while lawyers and judges figured out better solutions. Over the years, we helped maybe 60 kids find their way back to their families or into homes that honored who they were. And after your wife died, Bob's expression grew soft with remembered love and ongoing grief. Catherine made me promise to keep going. Said the kids needed someone who understood that culture isn't something you can just replace with therapy and good intentions. She was right, as usual. Maya finished her cheeseburger in thoughtful silence, processing the idea that her rescue hadn't been a random act of kindness, but part of a larger mission that had grown out of loss and love and a refusal to let bureaucratic indifference destroy more young lives. As they prepared to leave the diner, Dolores appeared with a paper bag containing 2 pieces of apple pie. For later, she said, winking at Maya. Bob's got a sweet tooth, and I suspect you might too. The drive to the ranch took them deeper into countryside that felt increasingly removed from institutional Colorado, through landscapes that reminded Maya more of home than anywhere she'd been since leaving New Mexico. As they turned onto a gravel road, marked by a simple wooden sign reading Coleman Ranch, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 months, the possibility that she might finally be somewhere she could belong. The Coleman Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of high Colorado prairie, where the land rolled in gentle waves toward the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. As Bob's pickup truck crunched along the gravel driveway, Maya pressed her face to the passenger window, taking in her first glimpse of what would be her home for the foreseeable future. The main house was a 2-story log structure that looked like it had grown from the landscape itself, weathered to a warm silver gray that caught the late afternoon sunlight. A wraparound porch held rocking chairs and hanging baskets of wildflowers that swayed gently in the mountain breeze. Beyond the house, Maya could see a red barn, several outbuildings and pastures where horses grazed alongside Black Angus cattle that looked up with mild curiosity as the truck passed. "Home, sweet home," Bob said, pulling up beside the house. "It's not fancy, but it's solid and it's peaceful." Catherine always said the land itself did half the healing work for the kids who came to stay. Maya climbed out of the truck and immediately noticed the silence, not the oppressive quiet of institutional control, but the living silence of open spaces where wind moved through grass and birds called to each other from fence posts. The air smelled like sage and wildflowers, and something clean that she realized was the complete absence of urban pollution. "Maya, I want you to meet someone special," Bob said, leading her toward the pasture fence. He put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled, a sharp sound that carried across the field. Within moments, a paint horse came trotting toward them, her coat a beautiful mixture of brown and white patches that reminded Maya of the traditional pottery her grandmother used to make. "This is Spirit," Bob said, as the mare approached the fence, nickering softly. Catherine named her, said she had the gentlest soul of any horse she'd ever met. "Spirit's got a particular talent for knowing which kids need her attention most." As if to prove his point, Spirit extended her neck over the fence toward Maya, breathing warm air across her palm in greeting. Maya had always loved horses, but had rarely been around them since leaving New Mexico, where her father had kept 2 mares for ranch work and her mother had taught her to ride before she was old enough for school. "Can I pet her?" "She'd be offended if you didn't," Bob replied. "Spirit likes to think she's the official welcoming committee around here." Maya stroked the mare's neck, feeling the warmth of her coat and the solid reality of muscle and bone beneath her palm. Spirit stood perfectly still, as if she understood that this particular girl needed gentleness and patience, that sudden movements or demands for attention might be too much for someone who'd spent months walking on institutional eggshells. "Come on," Bob said after Maya had spent several minutes getting acquainted with Spirit. "Let me show you the house and get you settled in your room. We can do the grand tour of the ranch tomorrow when you've had a chance to rest." The interior of the house felt like stepping into a different century. Hardwood floors worn smooth by decades of use. Furniture that looked sturdy enough to survive generations of children and ranch life. And walls lined with photographs that told the story of a family's history. Maya noticed pictures of Bob and a dark-haired woman she assumed was Catherine. Images of various children and teenagers who had obviously stayed at the ranch over the years. And Native American artwork that suggested deep respect rather than tourist shop decoration. "Your room is upstairs," Bob said, leading her up a staircase whose banister had been polished smooth by countless hands. Catherine always insisted that kids needed a space that felt like it belonged to them, at least temporarily. The room he showed her was nothing like the institutional spaces she'd grown accustomed to. A double bed with a handmade quilt occupied one corner, while a desk by the window offered a view of the pastures and mountains beyond. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with novels, poetry collections, and texts on Native American history and culture. A small dresser held a lamp and a framed photograph of a sunrise over what looked like canyon country. "The bathroom is across the hall, and you'll share it with whatever other kids are staying here," Bob explained. "Right now, it's just you, but that changes depending on what's happening with the courts and social services. There's always at least one emergency placement bed available." Maya set her duffel bag on the bed and looked around the room with something approaching wonder. After months of shared spaces and institutional furniture, having a room that felt designed for comfort rather than mere functionality seemed almost luxurious. "Bob, can I ask you something about the legal stuff? I mean, what happens next with the court case and everything?" Bob sat down in the room's single chair, his expression growing serious. "Well, the emergency injunction I filed protects your religious rights while you're here, but it's temporary. We've got a hearing scheduled for next week, where a federal judge will decide whether to make those protections permanent. More importantly, we're going to push for a full review of your placement situation and see if we can get approval for your great-aunt's kinship application. What if the judge doesn't understand about the feathers? What if they decide the state was right to try to remove them? Maya, I've been fighting these battles for 20 years, and I've learned that federal judges tend to take religious freedom pretty seriously, especially when it involves government institutions trampling on constitutionally protected practices. The law is on our side, and we've got documentation of systematic cultural suppression at Evergreen that goes way beyond your case. Maya felt a flutter of hope mixed with anxiety. The idea that her situation might actually be resolved through legal channels seemed almost too good to be true, but Bob's confidence was reassuring. What about other kids? I mean, what happens to them if places like Evergreen have to change their policies? Bob smiled, and Maya realized this was exactly the kind of question he'd been hoping she would ask. That's the beautiful thing about constitutional law, Maya. When we win a case like this, it doesn't just protect you, it protects every native kid who comes after you. Every victory makes it a little bit harder for institutions to justify cultural erasure as treatment. That evening, Maya helped Bob prepare dinner in a kitchen that felt like the heart of the house. Unlike institutional food service, cooking here was a collaborative process. Bob teaching her his method for pan-frying steaks while she shared her grandmother's technique for making fry bread from memory. They worked in comfortable companionship, and Maya realized this was the first time in 8 months she'd participated in preparing her own food rather than simply consuming whatever had been provided for her. "You know," Bob said as they sat down to eat, "Catherine used to say that sharing food was the first step in rebuilding trust. She believed that kids who'd been institutionalized needed to remember what it felt like to have some control over basic things like what they ate and when." The steak was perfect, and the fry bread turned out better than Maya had dared hope, despite the unfamiliar kitchen and different altitude. As they ate, Bob shared stories about some of the kids who'd stayed at the ranch over the years, a Lakota boy who'd gone on to become a tribal lawyer, a Navajo girl who'd reconnected with her family and was now studying veterinary medicine, a Cherokee teenager who'd aged out of the system but stayed connected to the ranch community and now helped with new placements. What happened to the ones who didn't make it? Maya asked, thinking about Bob's nephew Danny. Bob's expression grew sad but not hopeless. "We lost some along the way. Kids who'd been too damaged by the time they got here, or who couldn't overcome the trauma of being separated from their cultures for so long. But Maya, I want you to understand something important. The ones we lost didn't fail because they were weak or broken. They failed because the system failed them first, before they ever had a chance to heal." After dinner, Maya helped with dishes, while Bob made coffee and checked phone messages from his answering machine. One message was from a lawyer named Sarah Mitchell, updating him on preparations for next week's hearing. Another was from someone called Tom Redcrow, who was apparently driving up from New Mexico with some items Elizabeth Begay wanted delivered to her great-niece. Maya's heart leapt. "Aunt Elizabeth is sending something?" "Sounds like it. Tom's a good friend of mine. Helps transport kids and family members when the distances are too far for regular visits. He should be here sometime tomorrow morning." That night, Maya lay in her new bed, listening to sounds she'd almost forgotten existed. Wind moving through trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft hooting of an owl somewhere in the darkness beyond her window. After months of institutional noise, staff radios, fluorescent light ballasts, the kids arguing or crying, the natural soundscape felt like a lullaby. She touched her grandmother's feathers, still secure in her shortened hair, and for the first time since the accident that had changed everything, Maya felt like she might actually have a future worth looking forward to. The legal battles weren't over. The bureaucratic challenges remained unsolved, and she was still 800 miles from the reservation that was her true home. But tonight, she was sleeping in a bed chosen for comfort rather than institutional convenience. In a house where her cultural identity was valued rather than seen as a problem to be solved, the next morning, Maya woke to the smell of bacon cooking and sunlight streaming through windows that didn't have bars or reinforced glass. She dressed quickly and found Bob in the kitchen, standing over a cast-iron skillet with the confident ease of someone who'd been cooking for himself and others for decades. "Sleep okay?" he asked, not turning around but somehow knowing she was there. "Better than I have in months," Maya admitted. "It's so quiet here." "Peaceful quiet, not empty quiet," Bob agreed. "Catherine used to say that silence could be healing or harmful, depending on whether it came from safety or isolation." They were finishing breakfast when the sound of an approaching vehicle reached them. Bob glanced out the kitchen window and smiled. "That'll be Tom Redcrow with your delivery from New Mexico." Maya followed Bob outside to meet a pickup truck that looked like it had traveled many long miles, dust-covered but well-maintained. The man who climbed out from behind the wheel was probably in his 40s, with long black hair braided down his back and a face that suggested both southwestern sun and southwestern wind. He wore jeans, boots, and a button-down shirt that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. "Tom Redcrow," he said, extending his hand to Maya. "You must be Maya Blackhorse. Your great-aunt Elizabeth sends her love and says to tell you that the prayers are working." Tom walked to the back of his truck and retrieved a carefully wrapped bundle that he handed to Maya with obvious reverence. "She asked me to tell you that these are things she wanted you to have while you're staying here. Things that might help you remember who you are while you're figuring out where you're going." Maya accepted the bundle with trembling hands, understanding instinctively that this was more than just a care package from home. This was her great-aunt's way of extending the reservation's protective embrace across the miles, of ensuring that Maya remained connected to her family and her culture, even while navigating the complexities of legal battles and placement hearings. "Should I open it now?" Maya asked. Tom smiled. "Elizabeth said you'd know the right time and place. She trusts your judgment about sacred things." Maya clutched the bundle close to her chest, feeling its weight and warmth and the unmistakable presence of love and intention that had gone into its preparation. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt truly connected to home, truly confident that she was still Maya Blackhorse, no matter how far the system had carried her from everything familiar. Maya waited until sunset to open her great-aunt's bundle, carrying it to a hill behind the ranch house, where she could see the mountains turning purple in the fading light. The spot reminded her of the mesa near her childhood home, where her grandmother used to take her to watch the stars emerge and listen to stories about the holy people. Inside the carefully wrapped package, Maya found treasures that brought immediate tears to her eyes. Her grandfather's silver bracelet, the one she'd worn every day until social services had confiscated it at her first placement. A small leather pouch containing corn pollen, blessed by traditional ceremonies. A hand-woven belt her grandmother had been making before the cancer took her strength. And at the bottom, wrapped in red cloth, a letter written in her great-aunt's careful handwriting. "My precious Maya," the letter began, "I am sending you these things, not because I think you have forgotten who you are, but because I want to make sure the world remembers. You are the granddaughter of Sarah Blackhorse, the daughter of Thomas and Maria Blackhorse, and the great-niece of Elizabeth Begay. You carry the prayers of your ancestors and the hopes of your people. No government form can change this. No institution can take this away." Maya read the entire letter twice, her great-aunt's words filling spaces in her heart that had been empty for months. Elizabeth wrote about the legal progress being made, about tribal leaders who were taking interest in her case, about changes being discussed in state policies regarding native children in foster care. But more importantly, she wrote about love, about belonging, about the unbreakable connections that linked Maya to her family and her culture, despite the miles and bureaucratic barriers between them. The federal court hearing took place the following Tuesday in Denver, in a building that felt very different from the social services offices Maya had grown accustomed to. Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom was paneled in dark wood and decorated with portraits of constitutional framers who had never imagined cases like Maya's, but whose words about religious freedom and equal protection provided the legal framework for challenging institutional cultural suppression. Maya sat beside Bob and his lawyer, Sarah Mitchell, watching as attorneys for the state of Colorado and Evergreen Center tried to argue that grooming policies trumped religious freedom when it came to institutionalized minors. Their arguments sounded hollow in the formal dignity of the federal courtroom, reduced to what they really were, bureaucratic convenience disguised as child welfare. Sarah Mitchell, a small woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of quiet intensity Maya recognized from the most effective teachers she'd known, methodically destroyed every argument the state presented. She cited federal laws protecting indigenous religious practices, presented evidence of systematic cultural suppression at state facilities, and called expert witnesses who testified about the psychological damage caused by forced cultural assimilation. But the moment that changed everything came when Judge Morrison asked Maya to speak for herself. "Miss Blackhorse," the judge said, her voice gentle but authoritative, "I'd like to hear from you directly about what these feathers mean to you and why their preservation is important." Maya stood up slowly, aware that every person in the courtroom was watching her, that her words might influence not just her own case, but the treatment of other native children in similar situations. She touched her grandmother's feathers one final time, drawing strength from their presence. "Your Honor, these feathers aren't jewelry or decoration. They're prayers my grandmother spoke over me when I became a woman in our tradition. Each one carries specific blessings that are supposed to guide and protect me throughout my life. When the state tried to cut them out, they weren't just trying to change my hairstyle. They were trying to sever my connection to my ancestors, my culture, and my identity as a Navajo woman." Maya paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "I've been in the system for 8 months now, and I've watched it try to turn me into someone I'm not. They've taken away my family, my home, my language, my traditions, and my name. They call me a resident or a case instead of Maya Blackhorse. The feathers were the last thing I had left that proved I'm still who my grandmother raised me to be." The courtroom was completely silent as Maya continued. "But this case isn't just about me. There are other native kids in these facilities right now who are being told that their cultures are problems to be solved, instead of gifts to be honored. If you protect my grandmother's feathers, you're protecting their right to remember who they are too." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully, making notes as Maya returned to her seat. The hearing continued for another hour, with closing arguments and legal technicalities that seemed almost anticlimactic after Maya's testimony. When the judge finally announced that she would issue her ruling within 24 hours, Maya felt simultaneously drained and hopeful. The call came the next morning, while Maya was helping Bob feed the horses. Sarah Mitchell's voice carried excitement that was impossible to miss, even through the scratchy connection of Bob's old cordless phone. "We won," she announced without preamble. "Complete victory. Judge Morrison issued a permanent injunction protecting your religious rights, ordered immediate policy changes at all state facilities, and mandated cultural sensitivity training for staff." But Maya, that's not even the best part. Maya felt her heart racing. "What's the best part?" "The judge also ordered an expedited review of your placement situation and directed the state to immediately approve your great-aunt's kinship application. She ruled that the state's reasons for denial were discriminatory and violated your right to family unity under the Indian Child Welfare Act." Maya sank down onto a hay bale, the phone trembling in her hands. After 8 months of bureaucratic battles and institutional placement, she was going home, really truly going home to the reservation, to her great-aunt Elizabeth, to the place where her name meant something more than a case file number. When? She managed to ask. "Elizabeth is driving up this weekend to get you." The paperwork should be finalized by Friday. Maya spent the rest of the week in a daze of preparation and emotional processing. Bob helped her shop for gifts to take back to New Mexico, horse treats for Elizabeth's old mare, coffee for the tribal council meetings Maya remembered from childhood, yarn for the weaving projects that kept her great-aunt's hands busy during the long winter evenings. But the most important preparation was emotional. Maya had to say goodbye to the ranch that had offered her sanctuary and to Bob Coleman, who had risked legal fees and bureaucratic complications to fight for a stranger's religious rights. "You know you're always welcome here," Bob said on her last evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Elizabeth has my number, and this ranch operates as an extended family network. You call if you need anything, or if you just want to talk." Maya nodded, understanding that the connections forged during a crisis often became lifelong bonds. Bob had shown her that there were adults in the world who would fight for what was right, even when it was difficult, who understood that preserving culture was as important as providing shelter. Elizabeth Begay arrived Saturday morning in a pickup truck that looked even more travel-worn than Tom Redcrow's had been. Its faded red paint and dented fenders testament to decades of reservation roads and practical use. But when Maya's great-aunt climbed out of the driver's seat, she looked exactly as Maya remembered, small but sturdy, with steel grey hair braided down her back and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades of life. Love and survival. The reunion took place in Bob's front yard, witnessed by mountains and horses and the kind of vast sky that made human problems seem manageable rather than overwhelming. Elizabeth held Maya for a long time without speaking, her weathered hands stroking her great-niece's shortened hair with infinite tenderness. "Your grandmother's feathers," Elizabeth said finally, touching them gently. "They're still there." "Still carrying her prayers." "They almost weren't," Maya replied. "If Bob hadn't intervened..." Elizabeth turned to Bob Coleman, with the frank appraisal Maya remembered from childhood. The way her great-aunt could size up a person's character in moments and render accurate judgments that rarely proved wrong. "Robert Coleman," she said formally, "my family owes you a debt that can't be repaid with money." "No debt," Bob replied just as formally. "Your great-niece taught me as much as I taught her." "Maybe more," Elizabeth smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something approaching mischievous. "Catherine was Cherokee, Tom Redcrow tells me. She would have understood about sacred things that can't be replaced once they're lost." "She would have liked Maya," Bob agreed. "And she would have been proud of the fight Maya put up for her grandmother's prayers." The drive back to New Mexico took most of the day, through landscapes that gradually shifted from Colorado prairie to high desert mesas, and eventually to the familiar red rock formations of Navajo country. Maya pressed her face to the passenger window as they crossed the reservation boundary, marked by a sign that read Navajo Nation in English and Diné Bizad. Elizabeth's trailer looked exactly as Maya remembered, small but immaculate, surrounded by a carefully tended garden where corn and squash grew alongside traditional medicine plants. The outhouse stood discreetly behind a stand of cottonwood trees, and the well pump that had failed state inspection standards for kinship placement sat beside the kitchen window, still providing the clean water that had sustained Elizabeth Begay for 30 years of residence. That evening, as Maya helped her great-aunt prepare mutton stew according to recipes passed down through generations, Elizabeth began the process of reintegration that would occupy the coming weeks and months. "Tomorrow, we'll go see the traditional healer for a ceremony for your return," Elizabeth said, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon her own grandmother had carved. "You've been away from the sacred places for too long, and your spirit needs to be rebalanced with the land and the holy people." Maya nodded, understanding that her healing would require more than legal victories and family reunification. The trauma of cultural suppression and institutional placement would need to be addressed through traditional methods as well as contemporary ones. Aunt Elizabeth, what happens to the other kids? The ones still in places like Evergreen? Elizabeth smiled with satisfaction. Your court case, it's already making changes. Tom Redcrow tells me that tribal councils across the Southwest are filing similar lawsuits, that the federal government is reviewing policies at all facilities that house Native children. Your courage, Maya. It's going to help kids you'll never meet. That night, Maya lay in a bed that had been her mother's childhood bed, in a room where the walls held photographs of 4 generations of Black Horse women, listening to sounds she'd thought she might never hear again. Coyotes calling in the distance, wind moving through sage, the absolute silence of desert night, unbroken by institutional machinery. She touched her grandmother's feathers one final time before sleep, understanding now that they had served their purpose not just as spiritual protection, but as symbols of resistance against a system designed to erase indigenous identity. They had survived boarding schools and social services and forced grooming policies, carrying prayers across generations of women who had refused to let their cultures die. 6 months later, Maya stood before a federal commission studying Native children in foster care, testifying about her experiences and recommendations for policy changes. She wore her grandfather's silver bracelet and her grandmother's turquoise necklace, her hair grown long again, with the sacred feathers restored to their traditional position. The system told me that my culture was holding me back from success, she said to the commissioners, her voice steady and strong. But my culture was the only thing that helped me remember who I was when everything else had been taken away. Preserving indigenous traditions isn't just about respecting religious freedom. It's about understanding that our identities are sources of strength, not problems to be solved. The Commission's final report, issued 8 months later, led to comprehensive reforms in how state agencies handled Native children in care. Facilities like Evergreen were required to accommodate indigenous religious practices, and kinship placement policies were revised to prioritize cultural connections over bureaucratic standards that had little to do with actual child welfare. Maya never returned to Colorado, but she stayed in touch with Bob Coleman, who continued his work with emergency placements and legal advocacy. Ms. Garcia left Evergreen 6 months after Maya's case and took a job at a community health center where she could help families instead of processing them through institutional machinery. And somewhere in the high desert of New Mexico, in a trailer that lacked running water but overflowed with love and wisdom, Maya Blackhorse grew into the young woman her grandmother had prayed she would become, strong in her identity, grounded in her traditions, and committed to ensuring that no other Native child would have to choose between preservation and survival. The sacred feathers remained in her hair, carrying prayers across time and space, proof that some connections are too powerful for any institution to sever. 2 years after her return to the reservation, Maya found herself standing in the Denver airport, traveling back to Colorado for the first time since her rescue from Evergreen. But this time, she wasn't alone and frightened. She was accompanied by her great-aunt Elizabeth and 3 other tribal elders, all of them invited to speak at a national conference on indigenous child welfare reform. The conference was being held at a downtown hotel, worlds away from the institutional settings where Maya had once been processed like cargo. As she walked through the lobby in her traditional velvet blouse and silver jewelry, Maya noticed the stares of other attendees, social workers, policymakers, and academic researchers who were probably seeing their first real example of what successful cultural preservation looked like. Dr. Patricia Winters, the conference organizer, greeted them with obvious nervousness. She was a well-meaning woman in her 50s who had clearly done her homework about appropriate protocols for welcoming tribal representatives, but whose academic understanding of indigenous issues had never been tested by real-world contact with the communities she studied. Ms. Blackhorse, Mrs. Begay, thank you so much for coming, Dr. Winters said, carefully pronouncing their names as she'd obviously practiced. Your keynote presentation tomorrow morning has generated tremendous interest. We've had to move it to the main auditorium to accommodate all the registrations." Elizabeth acknowledged the greeting with the formal dignity Maya remembered from important tribal meetings. But her great-aunt's sharp eyes were already assessing the conference setup, noting who was present and who was conspicuously absent from conversations about native child welfare. "How many tribal representatives are speaking at this conference?" Elizabeth asked directly. Dr. Winters consulted her tablet with obvious discomfort. "Well, you and Maya are our primary indigenous voices, though we have several academics who specialize in Native American studies." "Academic specialists," Elizabeth repeated, her tone neutral but pointed. "And how many people will be making decisions about Native children based on what they learn here?" The attendee list includes department heads from 12 states, federal policy coordinators, and representatives from major child welfare organizations across the country. Maya watched her great-aunt process this information, understanding that Elizabeth was calculating the potential impact of their testimony against the reality that most decisions about indigenous children were still being made by non-native people who viewed cultural preservation as a nice idea rather than a legal and moral imperative. That evening, Maya walked through downtown Denver, past the social services building where Ms. Henderson still worked, past the street corners where she'd waited for buses that carried her between placements. The city looked different now, smaller somehow, less threatening, as if her survival and success had diminished its power to intimidate her. She found herself standing outside Evergreen Center, studying the razor wire and institutional architecture that had once represented the complete destruction of her identity. A security guard noticed her presence and approached with professional suspicion. "Can I help you with something, miss?" Maya smiled, recognizing the tone of authority she'd once found so frightening. "I used to be a resident here. Just wanted to see how the place was doing." The guard's expression shifted to something approaching curiosity. "When was that?" "About 2 years ago. I was here for about 12 hours before a federal court order got me released." Recognition dawned in the guard's eyes. "You're the girl with the feathers, the one who sued them over the grooming policy." Maya nodded, surprised to be remembered, but not entirely shocked that her case had become part of the facility's institutional memory. "Things have changed a lot since then," the guard continued, his tone suggesting approval rather than resentment. "New policies, cultural liaisons, even a sweat lodge for native kids who request traditional ceremonies. The administration doesn't like to admit it, but your case pretty much forced them to completely overhaul how they handle indigenous residents." Maya felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that systematic changes had been implemented. Sadness that it had required federal litigation to force basic human decency into institutional practice. The next morning, Maya stood before an auditorium containing nearly 800 people who had come to hear her story. But instead of beginning with her own experiences, she started with something else entirely. "Yesterday I visited Evergreen Center, the facility where the state of Colorado tried to cut away my grandmother's prayers," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "A security guard told me that things have changed there, that they now accommodate indigenous religious practices and cultural needs. That's good news, but it raises a question that should make all of us uncomfortable. Why did it take a federal lawsuit to convince a government institution to respect the Constitution?" The auditorium was completely silent, and Maya could see in the faces before her the uncomfortable recognition that systematic cultural suppression had required external force to change. That internal moral authority had been insufficient to prevent institutional abuse. "My case became famous because I fought back publicly, because I had advocates with resources and legal knowledge, and because my situation was documented by media attention. But for every Maya Blackhorse whose story becomes a federal case, there are dozens of other native children whose Cultural identities are being systematically erased in facilities across this country without anyone ever knowing their names. Maya went on to describe not just her own experiences, but those of other Indigenous children she'd met through her advocacy work, kids who had lost their languages in therapeutic boarding schools, teenagers who had been denied access to traditional healing ceremonies in residential treatment, families who had been separated because social workers didn't understand the importance of extended kinship networks in native communities. The most insidious form of cultural genocide isn't dramatic or obvious, Maya continued. It's the daily process of teaching children that their identities are problems to be solved, that their traditions are obstacles to success, that becoming acceptable to mainstream society requires abandoning everything that connects them to their ancestors. She paused, looking out at an audience that included many of the same types of professionals who had processed her through the system 2 years earlier. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't just a problem for Native communities. When institutions are allowed to systematically suppress Indigenous cultures, they're practicing for the suppression of anyone who doesn't fit standard molds. The same policies that tried to cut away my sacred feathers are used to force conformity on children from immigrant families, kids with disabilities, teenagers who express their identities in ways that make bureaucrats uncomfortable. Dr. Winters had scheduled 45 minutes for Maya's presentation, but she spoke for over an hour, the audience so engaged that no one seemed to notice the extended time. When she finally finished, the standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Maya understood that applause was easy. Implementing actual change would be much more difficult. During the question and answer period that followed, Maya fielded inquiries from social workers who wanted practical guidance on working with Native families, from policymakers who were struggling to balance institutional efficiency with cultural accommodation, and from tribal representatives who were fighting similar battles in their own states. One question came from a young woman who identified herself as a recent social work graduate. Ms. Blackhorse, how do we change a system that seems designed to process children rather than truly help them? Maya considered the question carefully before answering. You start by remembering that every child in the system is someone's relative, someone's hope for the future, someone whose story matters beyond their case file number. You ask yourself whether the decisions you're making would be acceptable if they were being made about your own children or grandchildren. And when you see cultural suppression happening, you do what Ms. Garcia did in that grooming station. You find the courage to say, I can't do this. The conference continued for 2 more days, with panel discussions, policy workshops, and networking sessions that would theoretically translate Maya's testimony into concrete reforms. But Maya understood that real change would happen gradually, one caseworker at a time, one policy revision at a time, one child at a time who was allowed to maintain their cultural identity while receiving the support they needed. On the flight back to New Mexico, Elizabeth looked out the airplane window at the landscape passing below, a patchwork of urban development and agricultural fields giving way to the desert landscapes of home. Your grandmother would be proud, she said quietly. Not just because you kept her feathers, but because you used your experience to help other children keep theirs. Maya nodded, understanding that her story had become larger than her individual survival, that the sacred feathers in her hair now carried prayers not just for her own future, but for all the Indigenous children who would benefit from the policy changes her case had initiated. Back on the reservation, Maya continued her education while also working part-time for the tribal court system, helping to develop protocols for cases involving Native children in state custody. She learned that policy change was slow and often frustrating work, that victories were frequently partial and temporary, but that persistent advocacy could create cumulative improvements in how institutions treated Indigenous families. 3 years after her return home, Maya received a letter that brought her full circle. It was from Jessica Walsh, her former roommate at the Riverside Group home, who had aged out of the system and was now studying social work at a community college in Denver. Maya, Jessica wrote, I saw your speech on YouTube, and I wanted you to know that you inspired me to go back to school and study social work. I've been thinking about our conversations in that little room, about how you never stopped believing that you deserved better treatment. I want to work with kids in the system, particularly kids who are fighting to maintain their identities while dealing with placement issues. I want to be the kind of social worker who would have fought for you instead of processing you. The letter reminded Maya that individual stories of survival and resistance could ripple outward in unexpected ways, inspiring others to join movements for systemic change. Jessica's decision to enter social work with a commitment to cultural preservation meant that future children would benefit from Maya's courage to resist institutional erasure. On her 18th birthday, Maya participated in a traditional ceremony led by her great-aunt Elizabeth, a ritual that formally recognized her transition to full adulthood within Navajo tradition. The ceremony took place at dawn, on a mesa overlooking the desert landscapes of her childhood, witnessed by extended family members and community elders who had supported her journey through the foster care system and back to cultural wholeness, as Elizabeth braided new eagle feathers into Maya's hair alongside the original ones her grandmother had blessed. Maya understood that the sacred objects had served their purpose, not just as personal protection, but as symbols of cultural continuity that no institution could permanently destroy. The feathers would continue to carry prayers forward into whatever future Maya chose to build, reminding her that she was connected to something larger and more enduring than any individual struggle or victory. They were proof that love and identity could survive even the most systematic attempts at erasure, and that the courage to resist cultural suppression could inspire others to claim their own power to remain whole. The sacred feathers remained in her hair, carrying prayers across time and space, proof that some connections are too powerful for any institution to sever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.